Welcome to this explainer. Listen, I'm absolutely thrilled to have you here today because we're tackling one of the most profound, defining questions of modern civilization. We're going to explore this massive, overarching theme of how citizens actually respond to government overreach. Throughout history, societies have constantly wrestled with this fundamental friction. What exactly is the relationship between the sweeping power of the state and the autonomy of the individual? Well, as you'll see, the answers vary wildly depending on whether you're looking at this through the lens of a philosopher or through the incredibly precise lens of a constitutional lawyer. So it's a simple question, right? But it's incredibly loaded. What happens when the law is unjust? This right here sets up the absolute fundamental tension we're examining today. It's this monumental clash between a citizen's internal moral compass and the external, hard authority of the state. Think about it. If the state commands you to do something your conscience actively rejects, whose rules do you follow? Do you just obey the law to maintain order, or do you break the law to maintain your humanity? Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today's explainer, bridging 19th century American philosophy with 20th century German constitutional law. We'll cover 1. The citizen versus the state. 2. Thoreau's civil disobedience. 3. The legacy of conscience. 4. Germany's Article 20. 5. The right to resist. And finally, 6. Morality versus legality. Let's jump right into section 1. The citizen versus the state. To really kick things off, we need to recognize a foundational truth about the social contract we all live under. It actually often demands friction to operate properly. A healthy society isn't necessarily one with perfect, unblinking obedience. No, the balance of power is an ongoing, active struggle between individual conscience and government mandates. In this explainer, we're going to look impartially at two highly distinct approaches to managing this exact struggle. One is deeply rooted in personal philosophy and morality, kind of arguing from the outside in. And the other? It's strictly codified in national law, arguing from the inside out. But both are trying to solve the exact same problem: what to do when a state goes rogue. Moving on to section 2, Thoreau's civil disobedience. Let's start with the philosophical approach. We're going to introduce the deeply moral and individualistic perspective of an American icon, Henry David Thoreau. Now, to really grasp Thoreau's argument, we got to look at his historical context in 1840s New England. Back in 1849, he published an essay, originally titled Resistance to Civil Government, which of course we now famously know as civil disobedience. Thoreau was absolutely infuriated by two major defining issues of his day. First, his intense, lifelong opposition to the institution of slavery. And second, his fierce objection to American imperialism, specifically the Mexican-American War. To Thoreau, the government wasn't just making, minor administrative errors. It was actively functioning as an agent of profound corruption and extreme injustice. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is Thoreau's brilliant metaphor of the government as a machine. He argued that if a machine is churning out injustice, like slavery or an unjust war, it wasn't nearly enough to simply disagree with it. He firmly believed conscientious citizens must actively halt it. He wrote, "Let your life be a counterfriction to stop the machine." You don't just complain about the gears, right? You throw yourself into the gears to grind the whole shebang to a halt. Thoreau actually went a step further. He argued that voting is merely wishing for justice. Majorities, he noted, don't possess inherent wisdom or morality just because they outnumber the minority. If a law is inherently unjust, just waiting around for a political process to eventually change it, completely unacceptable. He believed genuine justice requires withdrawing practical and financial support from a corrupt state. And man, he practiced what he preached. He literally spent a night in a Concord jail for refusing to pay his poll tax. Though, actually, much to his annoyance, his aunt went ahead and paid the tax to bail him out the very next morning. But still, his core argument remained: to fund a state that commits violence is to become a collaborator in that violence. For him, a wounded conscience was way worse than physical imprisonment. Let's head into section 3, the legacy of conscience. Let's move to and see how this builds across the timeline of human rights. Because Thoreau's night in jail might have seemed like a super localized act of defiance, but its intellectual ripples totally changed the course of history. So, in 1849, Thoreau publishes his essay. Fast forward to 1907, and a young Mahatma Gandhi is launching his Satyagraha, his non-violent resistance campaign in South Africa. Gandhi explicitly credited Thoreau's essay, calling its incisive logic unanswerable, and he applied those very principles to the struggle for Indian independence. Then, in the 1950s and 60s, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. leads the American civil rights movement. King noted that reading Thoreau was his very first contact with the theory of nonviolent resistance, applying this exact legacy of creative protest to boycotts and sit-ins. From one man in a local jail to the shaping of a global philosophy of nonviolent protest, the legacy here is absolutely staggering. All right, Section 4. Germany's Article 20. Now, we are going to pivot dramatically from 19th century American philosophy, which was built on individual defiance, to the rigid post-war constitutional law of modern Germany, which is built on institutional preservation. Let's systematically break down the first 3 paragraphs of Article 20 of the German Basic Law, or Grundgesetz. Paragraph 1 establishes the state structure. Germany is a democratic and social federal state. Paragraph 2 secures sovereignty. All state authority emanates from the people, and it's exercised through elections and specific legislative, executive, and judicial bodies. And then paragraph 3 solidifies the rule of law. The legislature is bound by the constitutional order, and the executive and judiciary are bound by law and justice. Now, what is absolutely vital to understand here is that these 3 paragraphs form the unchangeable, stable baseline of the Republic. They're actually protected by an eternity clause. Legally, they cannot be altered. No way, no how. Which brings us to Section 5, the right to resist. But, as we know, history is rarely completely stable. So let's introduce the disruptive, really explosive element that was added to Article 20 decades later. Paragraph 4. Now, this was not in the original 1949 document. It was actually added during the highly controversial 1968 Emergency Acts. It literally legalizes resistance, Widerstandsrecht, against anyone who attempts to abolish the constitutional order we just outlined. Impartially speaking, this was fiercely debated. Back in 1949, lawmakers, including prominent figures like Carlo Schmid, originally rejected a resistance clause. They warned it would basically be an open invitation to breach the peace. But by 1968, right in the thick of the Cold War and mounting domestic tensions, it was inserted to ensure the state had a final civilian line of defense against an authoritarian overthrow. So, the crucial point is that this is absolutely not a license for everyday lawbreaking or casual protest. It is strictly an ultima ratio, a final, absolute last resort for German citizens. To actually invoke it legally, you have to follow these steps. First, all legal remedies, or Rechtsweg, must be completely exhausted. You can't just take to the streets if the courts are still functioning. Second, the democratic order must be actively threatened with destruction. And third, the resistance must be proportional and aimed squarely at restoring the Constitution, not replacing it with some new one. And finally, Section 6, morality versus legality. We've now entered our final section, where we get to intellectually synthesize these 2 fascinating concepts of resistance. And this brilliantly illustrates the core contrast. On one side, we have Thoreau. His whole framework is based on individual conscience. It's proactive, and it's heavily focused on protesting and breaking unjust laws, even if the government itself is stable. On the other side, we have Article 20, Paragraph 4. This framework is completely based on the constitutional order. It's entirely reactive, and it is focused strictly on defending and preserving the democratic system against those who would try to destroy it. So you have the philosophical duty to break a corrupt system on one hand, and the codified legal duty to save a democratic one on the other. So we leave you with this final provocative thought. Where exactly do we draw the line between civil disobedience and preserving the state? When that tension between the individual and the government finally snaps, what demands a stronger response from the citizen? A wounded conscience, just like Thoreau warned about, or a wounded democracy, exactly as the German Constitution prepares for? It's a delicate, truly incredible balance that continues to define our world today. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope this sparked your curiosity, and I highly encourage you to keep exploring these fascinating ideas.